Hi, this is Charles Hoskinson broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. Welcome to People of IOG. And today we're joined by a very special guest, IOG's Director of Education, Dr. Lars Brunjes, and my good friend. Lars, thank you so much for coming on. How's your day been?
Thank you for having me. Very nice. Actually, last weekend we still had snow, but now the spring finally arrived. So it's very nice and sunny. I think it was 21 degrees. No idea what that is in Fahrenheit, but very nice and warm.
Yeah, and you're based in Munich these days or just outside of Munich?
Yeah, it's 100 kilometers off Munich. It's called Regensburg. It's very nice, 2,000-year history. Roman founded it. Beautiful medieval downtown, so it's very pretty.
I've never been to Regensburg, although I've been to Munich, so that's my only place of reference. But I think that's close to a large forest, so that it must be beautiful. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. I always love doing these interviews in a kind of a chronological order. So where are you from? Where were you born? Let's start there.
I was born in Wuppertal, which is in the Ruhr area. It's a relatively small town. I think there are only two claims of fame. I think Engels was born, the collaborator of Marx, and we have a Schwebebahn. That's, I think, the only commercial hanging train in the world. It's because it's in a narrow river valley, and they somehow didn't have space to put like a train or a tram there, so they built the train hanging over the river. So there are pillars left and right to the river, and then the train is hanging beneath it. And yeah, that's basically the only claim to fame of that city.
And this was back in the 1970s?
I'm born in 1971, yes.
1971. So what was 1971 Germany like? Let's try to get an understanding of the setting.
I mean, I obviously can't remember that far back, but I mean, I do remember that, when I grew up, I was very much scared because of the Cold War. And I mean, it was West Germany. I grew up in Cologne, incidentally. I moved from Wuppertal when I was 1 year old. My father got a job in Cologne, so I grew up in Cologne. But even though it was West Germany, it was quite scary times with the Cold War. And we also had relatives in East Germany, so I visited a couple of times as a child. My father actually is born in Jena in East Germany, and he actually basically escaped to the West when he was in primary school, I think. In those days, it wasn't so strict. I mean, the wall hadn't been built. But his grandfather worked for Carl Zeiss Jena, which is still a thing. I mean, they built these high-quality optics. And I think his grandfather was a salesman for them, so he could travel to the West. And he took my father illegally and hid him under his coat in the train compartment to smuggle him out to the West. So
and this was back in the 1950s or 1960s?
Yes, I think my father was like 10 years old or something. Or 8. So he learned writing in East Germany and then had troubles because they somehow used a different system in West Germany, primary school. So he had some trouble adopting. So yeah, must have been early 1950s.
So your father was smuggled in a coat right when the Cold War was starting to brew a bit, and immediately had a little bit of a culture shock. Now, what was West and East Germany in terms of how you travel between? So you mentioned when you were in your early years, about 10 years old or something like that, you actually went to East Germany. So how did you actually do that? Because I believe the wall was up at that point.
Yes, but not everybody actually could travel. I mean, you needed a visa, but because we had relatives, so my father's aunt and their daughters were still living there, so we had relatives, so we could travel. And but it was very scary, especially for me as a child, because not the wall. I mean, the literal wall was just in Berlin,
right?
But I mean, there was this like death strip with watchtowers and automatic guns and watchdogs, and it was this huge border control installations. So it was very scary, and they really checked you very, very carefully. So they basically took apart the whole car, because some people escaped like in in gas tanks or under the seats. So they more or less really disassembled the car and took out
they disassembled your car traveling there. Wow.
I mean, they put like sticks into the tank, and you had to like flip the back seat over to show that nobody's hidden there. And and really, really carefully study your face. And they took your passports, and then the passports disappeared. They had this conveyor belt thing where the passports were hanging and then disappearing. And then you had to wait for half an hour or so until they came back. And then, of course, you were worried if they decide not to give it back to you, what then? And so yeah.
So you grew up in Cologne when you were a little child, and then you're visiting your relatives in Eastern Germany. What was the culture difference like? Was there like an aura of fear, or what was East Germany like?
I mean, I always felt very depressed somehow. I mean, the most striking thing was the lack of color somehow. I mean, first of all, like commercials. Not that I'm a big fan, but I mean, they add color to a city, and as soon as you cross the border, that wasn't there. Although you did get some of these big propaganda posters everywhere. That was, I mean, all like with our friends from the Soviet Union to peace and prosperity, and United Workers for Peace, and I mean, you had these huge propaganda posters. But apart from that, it all looked very gray. I mean, no commercials, no ads, and also no paint, because a lot of people couldn't afford to paint their houses, so everything had this gray and dilapidated tint somehow. On the other hand, I mean, of course, people are people, so it's not as if everybody was permanently depressed there. But there was this air of fear, because, I mean, there were lots of spying. I mean, for example, neighbors reported on each other, so everybody had to be careful what they're saying. And I mean, they did tell political jokes, of course, but always had to be careful that nobody's listening and reporting you to the secret police. And
right.
And we had to report to the police, I think. So once we got there the next day, we had to go to the police precinct and basically register that we are there. And so that was also a bit scary, obviously. And yeah, so it, as a child in particular, I always felt quite scared there. So it was definitely a culture shock. And then obviously also I remember, I mean, it's not that they were starving. I mean, they had enough to eat. But for example, my relatives invited us, and then we ate. And I mean, I was a child, so I didn't know any better. And then I took like 2 sausages because after one, and then everybody was looking shocked. And then later my parents told me that was very rude of me, because obviously they had been so happy that they actually got these sausages for the special occasion, and they got exactly 1 for each. And I just grabbed one because I was so used to, I mean, in West Germany, that if you're hungry, I mean, there's always plenty and you can eat as much as you want. So as a child, I didn't realize that, I mean, how rude that was, that
wow.
Stuff like that. Or once I played with a ballpoint pen and broke it. I mean, not on purpose, but I was like fooling around and broke it. And my aunt was very upset. And then I said, yeah, but what are you getting upset about? Just buy a new one. I mean, because it's it doesn't cost anything. They throw them after you everywhere normally.
Right.
But I mean, there it was a big thing. So that was really horrible that I broke that.
So did you have any brothers and sisters?
No, I'm an only child.
An only child. Okay. And what did your father and mom do? So what was your father's profession?
They're both mathematicians in a sense. So my mother was a high school teacher for mathematics and physical education. And my father was a mathematician. He worked in an insurance company. So nowadays you would say actuary, I think.
Right. So you had from the very beginning, a very rigorous, very analytic family. Yes. And I suppose computing was just being introduced to Germany, especially West Germany, around the 70s. So, what was your earliest computer? Did you ever have one at home, or did you have access to one as a child?
Yes, actually, I mean, as you said, in the 70s, and then at some point, probably late 70s, my father's department got one, like an IBM 5110, I believe, that had basic and APL. And was something like $50,000 or whatever. And so then he made the mistake to tell me about it. And then I became so interested. And at that time we were on vacation in Austria and doing a lot of hiking. And me being a child, I was bored. And then my father, the whole vacation, entertained me by telling me about how computers work and what he can do with it. And my mother was highly irritated because she always had to traipse behind us while the 2 of us were talking about computers. And then when we came back, that was just when one of the first home computers came out. That was, in my case, Sinclair ZX81. It's this little plastic box with a plastic keyboard that's just foil keyboard, so it's no individual keys, and it has 1 kilobyte of RAM and BASIC hardwired in. So we ordered that when we came back from that vacation. But then the whole 3 weeks or so remaining of the summer vacation, because it was just a very small startup, and they were sitting in Aachen and basically sold the stuff from a garage. So they had problems delivering. So I was desperately waiting for this computer to arrive, and it didn't come. So I took my mother's typewriter and wrote basic programs on the typewriter, because my father had given me some manuals from his work. So I learned basic, but I mean, I couldn't try it out. But then I used the typewriter to actually write my first programs, but I couldn't try them, so I had to run them in my head. And then basically on the last day of the vacation, this little ZX81 finally arrived.
And so, what was that? Was that a Zilog system or an Intel system? What was the CPU and the assembly? How did that work?
A Z80.
Oh, Zilog 80. Okay.
8-bit, right? But BASIC was basically in the ROM, so you just plugged it in, and immediately you had a BASIC cursor.
Oh,
and
wow.
And as I said, 1 kilobyte RAM. But I immediately, from the beginning, had a 16 kilobyte RAM memory extension, but no hard drive, of course. And the only mass storage was a tape recorder. So, and you had to connect it with a normal microphone cable, and that was horrible, because you had to get the volume of the tape recorder exactly right to, if you made a mistake, and it took long, of course. I mean, I had a flight simulator at some point, and that took 8 minutes or so to load. And if you didn't get the volume right, then you had to rewind and do it all over again.
That's a nice analog to digital conversion there. That's really cool. So what was your first program that you wrote with that you remember?
I do remember trying to draw a sine graph. I don't know whether it was the very first one, but I think one of the first, because it also didn't have high resolution graphics. It had 64 times 48 pixels. So it was very rough, but I remember doing a sine graph and just simple stuff. I mean, writing your name 100 times. And I mean, I was 11 or 12 or something. So it wasn't very sophisticated, but
well, not many 11-year-olds were programming their own computer, writing sine graphs. I think you were a little bit ahead of the curve at that one. So, what were your teens like? So, were you still in Cologne at the time? Your dad's still an actuary, and your mom's still teaching?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So, what was German education like in I guess it would be the early 80s at this point in West Germany?
Right. I think it's still this. I mean, I don't know whether it has changed much. So, I mean, in Germany, we had this. I mean, first it's 4 years primary school, and then we have this. I think it's unusual in the world system, where basically we have 3 different types of high schools, and you can. I mean, one is basically for people, or at least that was the original idea, for people that intend to become craftsmen or work with their hands, and then the middle one is for like accountants and people that work in a bank or whatever. And then the other one, those 2 are 6 years. And then the third one is 9 years. And that's if you want to go to university. And in principle, after primary school, you have to decide. I mean, it's possible to change afterwards, but it's not very easy. So actually the direction is set quite early in Germany, and then it's difficult to switch again. Of course, nowadays, I mean, it shifts that. I mean, it's not like that the strict thing anymore, but we still, in most Bundesländer provinces, we still have this system with the 3 different high school things. And so I did go to the one that was 9 years for university. And yeah, I mean.
Well, let's talk about that. So you obviously have to make a major life decision very early. And why did you choose university? Was it because you always knew you wanted to be a mathematician, or you just knew you were going to go to university, but you hadn't decided? I mean, why not be a carpenter? Why not be a plumber? What was the impulse there?
I mean, I of course didn't decide it. I mean, I was 10 years old or so. So I think the idea is that the primary school teacher makes a recommendation, and normally you follow that, and but your parents can overrule it if they want. And I still remember that I honestly didn't know. I mean, I had no idea at some point what I would do or where I would go. And I was quite surprised when, for my parents, it was no question that obviously I will.
Right around the same time, I was living in Hawaii, and my parents made a decision to move to Colorado. I was about the same age, and I said, I want to stay in Maui. And they say, no, you have to come to Colorado. Well, I didn't have any say. So I understand going along for the ride. Okay, so you're in the 1980s Germany now. You're starting to come of age, and you're obviously aligned with mathematics and computing. And I guess the first major decision is, as you get closer to university, do you become a mathematician, or do you become a computer scientist, or are you going to become an engineer? I mean, so the
Right.
theory versus the applied side of things. And so where was your mind at 15-year-old, 16-year-old Lars?
I mean, Germany is very backward in a lot of regards, especially when it comes to like technical innovations. So, I mean, I still remember I was very frustrated. I mean, my father always used to bring me these computer magazines and stuff. And in one of those, I was 13 or so, I read that some, what do you say these days, First Nation or Native American reservation school had gotten like 30 Commodore 64s for their classroom. And I mean, at that time, my whole school had like one Atari something.
Okay.
So, and I mean, that is like a typical story for Germany. It's still like that. I mean, so there was not much in the line of computer education. I mean, I did have some, computer science at school, but that was also horrible because the teachers, of course, had no clue. I remember one teacher was my physics teacher. So he only used the computer. I mean, for him anyway, everything was just to support physics. Also mathematics for him was just, I mean, you just do mathematics in order to solve physical problems. And you just use computers to simulate physical systems. So he only cared, I mean, we did like orbits of the Earth around the sun, simulations like that, but I mean, not data structures or anything. So that was quite not very appealing. And I mean, there were universities in Germany that would have done that, but I mean, I was like a bit of a mama's child, so I also didn't really want to go away, so I wanted to stay in Cologne. And in Cologne, you couldn't even study computer science as a main subject. You could only take it as a minor subject. So that's what I ended up doing mathematics and then computer science as a minor subject. But I also haven't really regretted it, because in some sense, computer science is more or less a subset of mathematics. I mean, obviously not like hardware, but I mean, large parts of it are more or less a subset of mathematics. And I really did enjoy mathematics, so I haven't regretted that. Okay,
so you decided to go to university in Cologne to stay at home. Now, when you were in your teens and early 20s, did you travel a lot? I know you went to East Germany, but did you in Austria? But did you go anywhere else, like Africa, South America, or Asia during that time period?
I mean, my mother had a phobia of flying. I mean, by now, in the last 20 years or so, she has flown, but only like 3 hours or something. So we were restricted to Europe, but we always like to travel. So I mean, all over Europe. So we've been Scandinavia, England, Ireland, Scotland, France, Spain, Italy. Not so much Eastern Europe, but the Western Europe, I mean, a lot. But not, I think Turkey was like the most exotic one I got with my parents, basically. I had a foot in Asia, in this over the bridge in Istanbul.
So how old were you when you went to Turkey?
Oh, I think I was that was for my parents' 25th anniversary. I think I was already, I had started university already, so 20 or something.
Okay. Yeah, Turkey's a wild, wild place. I really love it. Did you have a chance to go to the Cappadocia and actually see those little spear mountains that they have?
No, I didn't. I mean, my parents have been there by now and were very impressed and did the balloon ride and so on, but I haven't.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of those once-in-a-lifetime trips you have to take. Okay, so German universities, they're legendary for rigor, they're legendary for discipline, or at least that's the brand that they like to broadcast. So what was going to, and what university in Cologne did you attend?
Maybe I should mention that before university, I first had to do military service in principle.
Oh, well, that's a big part of your life. Let's go there.
Although, I mean, we did have this this draft. Every man had to go in principle, but you could claim that you are a pacifist, and then basically had to go to trial to prove that you are a pacifist, and then you could do social service instead.
Right.
So I ended up doing that, and it wasn't as bad anymore. I mean, I had always heard these horror stories that when it started in the like 60s or so, when we started having an army again after the Second World War, they were really strict with this pacifist thing. So you really had to go to a trial, and they asked really difficult questions. I mean, they like, imagine a bunch of Russians is raping your wife, and you have a gun. Wouldn't you try to shoot them and stuff like that? But in my days, but when I was there, it wasn't so bad anymore. So I basically just had to write an essay, and then there was this mustering thing. So and then there was this room full of officers looking at me grimly, and then one had this essay and said, "Are you still standing by that?" Looking at me, and I said, yeah. And then, yeah, okay.
I had no idea that pacifism trials were a thing. That sounds like a very German thing. Are you sure, Herr Brunjes? Yeah. Okay, so what did you write in the essay? You're out of morbid curiosity. How do you sell yourself as a German pacifist in 1988 or 1989?
I think I mostly used. I don't know whether you know that novel. In German, it's Im Westen nichts Neues. I suppose the English title is Nothing New in the West or something. It's I mean, at least in Germany, it's a very famous anti-war novel from the First World War about this class of young high school students, or I mean, that basically in their last year get drafted into the First World War, and then they all die. I mean, over the course of the novel. So that's basically what the book is about, and that's one of the most famous anti-war ones. Right. So I basically quoted that and then passages from that, and I mean, there's lots of stuff about how useless it is, and senseless violence, and that the enemies are also just humans, and things like that.
Right. So you picked your favorite anti-war book. I probably would have cited Bertrand Russell and his critique of World War One, or maybe Tolkien's experience as World War One. But yeah, that's great. That's great. So you went on pacifism trial. You passed. So you had to do a year of social service instead. So what?
Yeah, actually, it was even longer. I mean, they claimed it would be the same for people that go to the army and for the social service things, but it was 3 months longer. And I mean, the official reason was that I think if you go to the army, then you're supposed to, for the next 10 or 20 years or whatever, every now and again for a weekend, go back to some maneuver. And if you do the social thing, you don't have to. So that's how they justified that it's 3 months longer. But obviously, it was just
because so 15 months of fun and adventure. So what exactly did you do? What made social work comparable or desirable over military work?
I mean, in Germany, I think it's also one of the few countries in the world where we actually have religious classes at school. So, I mean, I think that, I'm not completely sure whether, but anyway, at some point, might even have been Hitler that made a deal with the church that basically the church gets to teach in German schools, and the state pays everybody, every cleric below the level of bishop, something like that. So in any case, so we had like regular religious classes. You could, when you turned 14, you could opt out of that if you wanted to, but I mean, by default, you had religion classes. And 1 year when I was 14 or so, the teacher was actually not a teacher, but like a Protestant priest from the parish nearby, and he was very nice. So I really enjoyed his classes. So then when the time came for the social work, actually you can, I mean, they pick something for you but you can also suggest something. And of course it's better if you suggest something, otherwise you end up God knows where. So I saw he had like he had a note at our school that he's looking for somebody. So I applied to that, and then he agreed to take me, and that worked out. So I worked for this parish church, and it was mostly like a caretaker sort of. So I was mowing the church lawn and cleaning the toilets, and also like more fun things like driving the church bus and picking up the old ladies for the Bible classes. And
I have this Driving Miss Daisy Brunjes edition that just comes to mind. You was a little chauffeur hat driving the bus. Okay, so you were a gardener for a church for your military social service, and I assume you probably became friends with all the old ladies.
Oh yes, that was the best part. They were very, I mean, it was very endearing how grateful they were for the chance to be able to talk to somebody. And actually what was also a lot of fun, this priest, he was a very hands-on character. So he was always running around in coverall and repairing things. And he had this massive old-fashioned printing machine in the basement. And I mean, the church was printing lots of stuff like this church newsletter once a month and all sorts of things. And in order to save money, because I think it was cheaper than photocopies, if you made 1,000 copies, he used this old-fashioned printing press to print stuff like the church newsletter. And then that was actually the highlight of my month every month, because I then got to sit there for 2 days in the basement, not having to talk to anybody, supervising this machine. But it was really difficult because you could, for example, set the speed, and if you set it too slow, it takes forever. And if you set it too high, then sometimes paper gets pulled into all these rolls and wheels and stuff. And then you have to, if you don't stop it very quickly, then you have to disassemble the whole thing and wipe off the paper remains of everything. So I always, and this printing ink that it's impossible to wash off your hands. So in those days, I always had like black hands to my elbows, but that was a lot of fun. And just sitting there and trying to work the machine.
So you were a gardener, a bus driver, and a master printer covered in ink. And there was never an urge to become a forger and try to use the printing press to create something else?
Actually, I think I tried to print like business cards for myself at some point.
Stealing church property. That's damnation right there. Okay, so you finish up at the church, and then you go to the legendary German university, and that's in Cologne, for your undergrad.
Yes, just one more thing to the church thing, because I mean, it was nice somehow to do something completely different. And I mean, you can think a lot while you mow the lawn. I actually enjoyed that. It's very meditative. But at some point, I also got really bored intellectually. So there are these national competitions where you can that we had in mathematics and also computer science, and it's normally for students at high school. But there was this rule that somehow it's by your day of birth and not tied. So in any case, in that year where I was working for the school, even though I wasn't at school anymore, I was still allowed to enter. So that was actually, intellectually speaking, the highlight of that year, or those 15 months, that I could work on these problems a bit. I think I didn't get very far, maybe this third round or something, but anyway, that was fun. So
were they like correspondence problems where they'd send you a collection of problems, you'd work on them and fill them out, solve them, send it back, or how did that work?
Yeah, I mean, it was just, printed like 4 problems, and then you were supposed to write programs and document them and send it in. I think you sent in a disk. It was before the internet, so probably I put a disk into an envelope and sent it in or something. Yeah, I think so.
So actually, that brings up an interesting question. So math competitions were definitely a huge part of Eastern Europe and Russian culture, the Olympiads and these other things. What was that like in Germany? Did you guys have an equivalent system for math competitions there?
I must say that is one of the things I was always envious of Eastern Germany. Math was much more popular there. And incidentally, that was one of the highlights of going to Eastern Germany, or also having Eastern German relatives, was the math books they had. So normally for birthday or Christmas or so, they always sent math books, because math books were basically the only books you could actually read. That wasn't filled with propaganda and stuff. Even in the math books, I think they, by law, so they had to still put Marx or the party in somewhere. So in the beginning of a chapter, sometimes they quoted Lenin or whatever. But then
These are the people's problems.
But no, that was but the books, I loved them. I mean, they had lots of these. I mean, like entertaining mathematics, creational mathematics, and so that was really great. I enjoyed that. And in West Germany, it wasn't like that. So I mean, one thing I grew up with is that my mother always complained that when she was talking to her fellow teachers, that they not only didn't know math, I mean, they were basically bragging about it. And she said, so her colleagues said, I never understood math. And my mother was always so upset, not that they didn't understand it, but that they were proud of it, basically. This attitude that you can be proud of being stupid, basically, or in that area. And I think that was different in Eastern Germany, so that I really regretted. But we did have competitions. I mean, I did that at school for a couple of years. That I think it was first a internal school thing, but then I basically solved all the problems from all. I mean, I think I was like in standard 9 or something, but I solved all of them up to standard 13. And then one of the teachers gave me this German national math competition thing, and then later that was the same that they also had for computer science. So for a couple of years I entered that, was relatively successful as well. So yeah, we had that, but it was not as popular and not as much supported as it was in Eastern Europe. So that's sort of a pity.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not a big part of American culture as well. We do have several math competitions. Like I remember when I was at Metro State, I took the Putnam. I got a positive score, so that's something to say. But certainly didn't get to go to Harvard. So I obviously wasn't a fellow. God, that's a hard test too. Okay, so you're finally in German University in Cologne,
right?
Yes. And then we're finally here. You've gone through that. But actually, one last church question. I'm sorry, I have to ask this because I know you knit. Did you pick that up at the church? Did the old ladies teach you how to knit? I mean, where did that enter your life? Was that later or at the church?
That was a bit later. That was not at the church.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that then. I was just curious. It's like, how far did the driving Miss Daisy experience go? Okay, so we're at German University. You arrived your first day there. Were you still living with your parents, or did you live at the university, or how did that work?
Right. So earlier you asked which university. It was just Cologne University.
Okay.
And I mean, that is one thing in Germany. I mean, somehow it doesn't matter what university you go to in Germany. I mean, I know in the US it's very important. I mean, this Ivy League, or whether you go to Harvard but in Germany it really doesn't matter. Nobody gives a damn what university you go to. And they're all more or less, I mean, obviously sometimes you have a brilliant professor somewhere, or one town maybe has a reputation for being particularly good for one subject. But in general, they're all equal quality. And after you graduate, nobody is interested in what university you went to, which is one of the things I'm very proud of in Germany, actually. I mean, it's that, it's very, I mean, at my time, actually, it was free. So there was no tuition whatsoever. I think sometimes then they reintroduce some tuition, but it's something like $100 per year or so. So it's ridiculously low. So that I was always quite proud of, that university is more or less free. I mean, obviously we still have a problem that there's some imbalance between rich and poor, because even if you don't have to pay for university, you still have to live off something. Obviously you have to eat and so on. So like poor people are still disadvantaged. But it's far less so than in other countries. So that's actually quite cool in Germany. Yeah. And to answer your other question, so I was still living, I mean, it's Cologne, and Cologne, I mean, it's split into two halves by the Rhine. And the traditional, the center is left of the Rhine, but I grew up right of the Rhine, and the university is left. And so I was on the right. And in the first 3-4 years or so, 2-3 years, I was still living with my parents, and then took the tram every morning to get to university and then get back. And that was actually cool, because I used that time to read all the German classics on the tram, because I had always assumed that if you go to a German school and graduate at a German school, you read all the classics, because I always heard my parents talk about that. But we had this modern German teacher who somehow despised all the classics and believed that that is all not relevant anymore after the Holocaust. So we only read like very modern stuff. And I felt I somehow was cheated a bit out of my classical education. So then my parents had all these little Reclam. I don't know whether you also have them in the States. It's these tiny format books where all these plays, Goethe, Schiller, and so on. My parents had like 2 racks like this of all these tiny books, and they were perfect to read on the tram. I mean, sometimes on the tram you couldn't get a seat because it was crowded in the morning, but they were perfect to put in your jacket pocket, and then I could pull it out. And on my way to and from university, I always read that. So after 2 years or so, I had read all the German classics, at least all of those that my parents had in their bookshelf. So that was cool.
So when you say German classics, who are you referring to? Like 17th century, 18th century, something more contemporary, like Hans Fallada? Or?
I mean, obviously Goethe and Schiller. I mean,
yeah.
but also a bit more modern, like Brecht and Kafka. What's that?
See, I never had to read Kafka. I just lived Kafka. Yeah, that's the life of being a CEO.
Actually, Kafka is one of the modern German authors that I actually quite enjoy. I mean, it's interesting.
Did you ever read Life? Go ahead.
Brecht. I mean, I really like Brecht, I must say.
Did you ever read Life of Galileo from Brecht?
Actually, that is the one I didn't read, I think. But at school, we read Mother Courage and Her Children, and then I read, I mean, especially he has these very short stories that's only like 2 sentences. So there's this one how does it go? After you haven't changed at all, the friend said after not having seen him for a couple of years. Oh, I said, and grew pale. So that's the whole story. But basically that is not a compliment if you don't change. And he has this other cool story that I really like about somebody that allegedly invented refrigeration. So it's this English scientist, but actually he tells his maid to take the chicken and dig a hole in the ground and then bury the chicken and see what happens. And then I think the scientist dies, but the maid remembers and then eventually takes it out, and then they see it's still fresh. And then basically the moral of the story is that, I mean, all these famous people get credit, but actually it's the little people that do the real work. And
yeah, Brecht was a hardcore communist socialist, and so he really hated capitalism, especially through like the 3-penny opera or things like that. Okay, so you're reading German classics on the train. You go over. Did you have any hobbies when you were in college? Did you sports or chess club or these types of things?
I played tennis because my parents played tennis, so I also played tennis. I loved skiing, but obviously in Cologne you couldn't ski, so that was just once a year for 2 weeks, like Easter vacation. Swimming, but nothing really interesting. I mean, I read a lot, so and like to program. But
actually, I guess this is the first time you get to use like real computers because you're at a university and they have computers.
Yeah, but I mean, by that time, I think I had a like IBM PC at home. So yeah, I mean, it was actually more convenient to just use my own one than having to fight for like your times share at the university computer.
Okay.
I mean, later we did use mostly, I mean, in the early internet to play like games. So after lunch or so, then we would sit, a couple of friends sit and play these multiplayer online games, some of the first ones. I forgot what it was called, but
did you play Neverwinter Nights? That was one of the first. Okay.
No, it was some like flight and shoot game. So you like there was gravity simulated, and you had your spaceship, and you could shoot, and everybody else was flying around and shooting at you. But I never lasted very long. But it was still fun.
So you're playing video games and programming computers while studying math. Did the thought ever occur to you to become a game developer, or did you say, no, I'm just going to become a proper German mathematician?
Somehow, I felt that I had missed the timing. I mean, there was a time when basically single people could write games single-handedly and be successful. But I think at that time in the 90s, it was that all these big teams were creating games. So I somehow felt that I mean, obviously I could have joined one of those teams, but no, that didn't really cross my mind. Later I always felt that now with apps for mobile phones and so on, it's a bit like in the good old days in the 80s again, that it's easier for individuals to actually produce something. But there in the 90s, no, that wasn't very appealing to me. And I like playing games, but somehow not really. I never considered writing them. I was more interested in like artificial intelligence and stuff. So I tried to write neural networks and genetic algorithms and things like that.
Yeah, I noticed there's this constant pull towards programming and computer science, but then you keep trudging down the mathematics train. So you finish up at Cologne, and your undergraduate was in mathematics. What was your favorite math course there? Was it analysis or a geometry course, or did you take combinatorics? Like, what did you study as an undergrad in math?
I mean, as an undergrad, it's more or less the same for everyone. I mean, you have some choices, but everybody has to do analysis and linear algebra. And then I did complex analysis and algebra. And somehow I always enjoyed algebra more than analysis. I still remember at some point, I mean, after 2 years or so, I became a tutor. So that was like my first proper job where I actually earned some money. So the system is probably the same in the States, I suppose, that every week the students get exercises and then they have to hand in the solutions the next week. And then once a week they meet in small groups, like 20 or 30 students. And then there's a tutor that goes through the exercises, and they also picks students that have to present their solutions at the blackboard. And then the tutor also like explains sample solutions or answers questions and so on. So I did that, and I started after 2 years or so, and then did that basically for the rest of my university career. I kept doing that. And I still remember that at some point I had a fellow tutor, and so he came from this analysis direction, and I was from the algebra direction, and somehow there was this question, and amongst us tutors, we wrote a sample solution, so that not every tutor had to write a sample solution for every question. So we split that amongst us, and I came up with some like algebraic solution, like drawing a commutative diagram. So it's just a diagram, and then you see that. And he, I think for whatever reason, he had also a solution for that, and it was like lots of inequalities and epsilon in data.
That's the difference between an analyst and an algebraist. You guys get to draw a nonsensical picture and say, hey, look at this picture. It solves the problem, obviously, and the analyst just drinks whiskey while yelling at inequalities, saying, why doesn't this work at all? Okay, so you finish. Do you have to take a comprehensive exam to get into graduate school, or like we have the GRE in the United States? What is that like in 1990s Germany to get into grad school?
I mean, we had this special German system, so we didn't have this bachelor master's thing then. I think now we have it, but we had this what's called diplom, and something like 8 or 10 semesters, so 5 years or so. And there is something in the middle after 2 years. But that is not, so that's maybe sort of comparable to a bachelor's degree, but it wasn't a big thing. I mean, you had to pass the exam in the middle, but nobody normally left university after that. I mean, it was just an intermediate thing, so not very important. What we call diploma, so pre-diploma. So you had to pass that. So it was like, and that's it was oral examination, so analysis, linear algebra, and then I think you could pick something, and then your minor, so also computer science for me. And then after those 2 years, it just goes on. But it's not such a big interruption in the transition. I mean, it's basically just goes on normally. And
so as you transitioned into graduate study and actually doing research and thinking about novel things, why algebraic geometry over a different field? What excited you about algebraic geometry? And I always wanted to ask, why not computational algebraic geometry, considering that there's like so much of an overlap with computer science and the work that you do?
It was sort of like just luck, because I wanted to do something. I mean, it always depends on, on the curricula. I mean, the professors that want to like grow a group of students that can then do their diploma thesis with them, they like do a lecture series over 2 years or whatever with advanced stuff. And so it always depends on what professor at that time is available and what they do. And I think there was only that one that did something in the algebraic direction. And I wanted to do something algebraically. I didn't want to do analysis, and I definitely didn't want to do numerics or something applied. So
well, why not topology? You didn't like topology?
No, I did, but I think there was no. I love topology. That actually was one of my favorite lectures ever. Topology. That's very nice. No, but I mean, algebra somehow really appealed to me. These diagrams and also I must confess, because I didn't really understand it. So it was like the first time in my life that I found something difficult and that irked me, and I wanted to like understand it. So it was sort of that I tried to pick the most difficult one as well. So that was all it. And I mean, actually, it was even for me surprising that I ended up with algebraic geometry, because I never liked geometry. But I was always scared of geometry. I always thought that, oh no, at university, if they ask me to do geometry, I can't do that. But algebraic geometry, of course, is not really geometry. I mean, you don't need like geometric thinking in order to do algebraic geometry. So yeah, and that's actually, I mean, it certainly helps if you have it, but you don't need it.
So was it mostly coursework at that level, or were you doing actual research and reading papers, reviewing things, writing papers? What was that like, that experience?
I mean, the thesis, the diploma thesis is supposed to be like a little bit original, but like only a little bit. So in my case, we have this famous German mathematician, Gerd Faltings, who also won the Fields Medal, I think, for the Mordell conjecture. And he had written this paper, and that was very important, but the main theorem, nobody understood the proof. And then my task was basically to elaborate on the proof and explain it and expand it. And I ended up, it was a bit embarrassing. I mean, it was a proof by induction, so we had like 3 cases, n equals 1, n equals 2, and then the inductive step. And I think the main difficulty that people had was in the inductive step. But after handling this n equals 1 and n equals 2, which in the original paper was like 1 paragraph, or I mean like 10 lines. I mean, I had already written 100 pages or so in my thesis, and then my advisor said, no, that's enough, so let's stop there. So then I ended up basically writing about the proof of the, whatever conjecture in the dimensions 1 and 2 or something. But I mean, it was really, I mean, in my defense, I mean, that guy is really infamous for being obtuse, and I mean, it was very compressed. I mean, he wrote like 1 sentence, and every single word you could write a chapter or 2 about making sense of that and putting that on foundations. So,
so they're like, that's a very classic professor thing to do. So I have no idea what this prominent mathematician has written. Hey, Lars, can you go and do your dissertation on explaining how his proof works? That's great. Oh boy, is he still at Princeton?
I don't know, honestly, but I know he was. Yeah.
Okay.
And I also have met him at some point. I mean, not really. I mean, I was in some of his lectures, and he's an interesting person and very vicious to critics. And I mean, yeah, he's a personality as well.
Yeah, he's a brilliant guy. He studied physics and math, and then he just decided he wants to be a Fields medalist. Yeah, it takes a special type of personality to win the Fields medal. You have to be super competitive and publish a hell of a lot early on. And usually you get some incredible major result. You know, it's catching these guys is hard. Okay, so you write your dissertation, you finally finish your PhD. You're like, wow, this is amazing. I'm a proper mathematician now. So my understanding is that
PhD, of course, is like a different thing, right? We were a diploma now. PhD is a bit more than, I mean, that is a bit more original.
Yeah. So you get your master's thesis, and then you go on and you finally finish your PhD, but you ended up at Cambridge for your postdoc. So what happened there?
Right, that was because my advisor was, I mean, professional friends with Tony Scholl at Cambridge University. So when it was time for my postdoc, then he enabled me to go there. So that was interesting, of course, very fascinating to be in that environment. And for example, I met Sir Peter Swinnerton Dyer there, I mean, him of the Swinnerton-Dyer conjecture, the millennium problem.
Mm-hmm.
And when I gave a presentation of my PhD thesis, and then afterwards, traditionally, after these presentations, they all had a beer in the pub. So he ended up explaining to me how to get to that pub. That was quite fun. I mean, until that point, I hadn't even known that he's like just one person. I always thought Swinnerton-Dyer is like two people. One called Swinnerton, one Dyer, but so that's Sir Peter Swinnerton-Dyer.
Okay,
he was very kind.
So all your education was in German. You lived in Germany, and then suddenly you're in England, and you're actually, speaking in English. Well, how much of a shock was that to actually go from German on a daily basis to English on a daily basis?
Well, I should say that basically after school, obviously I learned English at school, but in the last years of school, I started sort of as a hobby picking up reading English novels. So I enjoyed that quite a lot. And then also, like now 20 years ago, I met my wife, and she's South African. So we speak like in a mixture of Afrikaans, English and German, mostly English at home. And that was like 2 years or so, or 1 year before I went to England. So at least I was used to speaking English on a daily basis when I went to Cambridge.
Mm-hmm.
But it was still tough, of course. I mean, even though my English was good, it's still, I mean, in certain situations it's difficult, like on the phone, or if there's lots of background noise, stuff like that. I mean, so it's not as if it was all very easy, but at least, yeah, I was used to speaking English, so that the language wasn't a big problem. So that was fine, and it was very nice.
That's good. So what was Cambridge like to study at as a postdoc?
I mean, it was just interesting how many people, and I mean, like Swinnerton-Dyer, and then I think at that time Hawking was also there, Stephen Hawking, still alive, and he was at the same building, even though I'm not sure I ever saw him. I mean, once I saw a guy in a wheelchair with lots of people around him, so I suppose that was him. But it was at least this institute, the DPPMS, Department for Pure Mathematics and Mathematical Physics, I think. This ultra-modern building, and it was actually like an experimental building. So I believe in the office that I had, the light switches, for example, weren't real light switches. They were like just talking to a computer, so everything was computerized, and the shutters at the windows were automatic, and so if they had a computer problem, then we couldn't switch on the lights, and the windows didn't open. But yeah, it was all super modern. And then, of course, obviously they had lots of events like hosting conferences and congresses, and so that was very nice to be in the middle of that.
So what did your research when you were at Cambridge focus on? Were you collaborating with anybody, or were you working mostly solo, or what was going on there?
Yeah, that was a bit weird. I was actually collaborating with somebody, but somebody from Germany.
So you went to England, he stayed in Germany. Okay.
Yeah, but I did meet him in Cambridge, though at a conference, and then we started talking and found out that we were both interested in that. And then he went back to Germany, but we kept collaborating. And that was now, different directions. So still algebraic geometry, but we tried to apply non-standard mathematics to algebraic geometry. So that was actually
like non-standard analysis, or like Robinson stuff?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So I don't know, that probably goes a bit far, but the inspiration was that, prime numbers are very important in number theory, obviously. And with this non-standard stuff, you suddenly have something like infinite prime numbers. And then somehow they bridge the gap between what we call characteristic P and zero, so the world of prime numbers and like the normal world of real numbers and rational numbers. And somehow our hope was one could use this non-standard analysis to bridge that, because there are lots of problems in mathematics that are either solved for the one side and unknown for the other, or the other way around. And somehow with the non-standard methods, you can build a bridge between them, and in some sense translate results from the one side to the other.
Yeah,
so that was quite interesting.
I have a somewhat analogous experience when I was studying mathematics. Is I was absolutely convinced that I could use something called quota complexes, which is a topological construction to actually discuss meaningful things about these analytic additive number theory problems like the Goldbach conjecture and Waring hypothesis and so forth. So you have this beautiful way of topologically expressing the Goldbach conjecture. And normally you can't do that. And I was like, oh, cool. Now I can use all these topology tools to actually talk about these discrete things. And perhaps we can talk about factorization in a really cool way. And of course, it was a road to nowhere. But it was a great 1 year of thinking and not really getting anywhere. But that's the fun part about mathematics, is that you can chase something for a very long time and you never quite forget it. And even if you don't get there, the journey is so much fun.
Exactly. So, actually, sorry for interrupting, but
no problem.
I mean, I always thought that nobody's interested in that. I mean, that's like an area of mathematics called model theory, and that was very much out of fashion in those days. So I always thought nobody ever read our papers. But just now, like a couple of weeks ago, when I was looking into this lean theorem prover and I introduced myself on the forum that they have, one guy said, "Oh, Lars Brunjes, I loved your papers on this non-standard thing and such cool work." So I felt very pleased that after almost 20 years now, somebody had actually read this stuff and still remembered it. So that's cool.
Yeah, that's the other cool thing. I think I was one of the few people to actually even talk to the quota complex guys. They published their paper probably in, I don't know, what was it, 2010, 2009 or something. And I said, hey, I noticed you have this great paper and I'm using it for these cool problems in number theory. And they said, that's exactly why we wrote it. And it's like, you're the first guy to email us. You'll find that life of a mathematician is quite, for our audience, it's quite isolated in many respects. You end up producing lots of work that very few people read. And even books, like Springer will ask you to write something and maybe 5 people will actually read the book. And they just do it because they have these great deals with libraries and they go, you have to buy our books. So they'll sell 50,000 copies or 100,000 copies of a book they have no intention for anyone to ever read. I was talking to a computer scientist years ago, and he said, well, you know, Charles, there's 2 types of code. There's code that you read and write and code that you just write. Write-only code. So there's write-only books. And mathematics, unfortunately, is filled with a lot of write-only books. Okay, so unfortunately, or fortunately, at least fortunate for us, you left the mathematical community. So you finished at Cambridge as a postdoc. Why didn't you go and try to pursue a professorship? What was the moment where you decided to go do something else and pursue something else?
I mean, after Cambridge, I went back to Regensburg and then was here at the university for a couple of years still.
Right.
And the problem somehow, I mean, in a lot of other countries, I know at least in England and France, they do have permanent positions for mathematics or for academics below tenure. So you can have a proper job that's not restricted. The time is not restricted, and then you can, quietly, peacefully work on your tenure. But in Germany, we don't have that, or at least we do have, but it's like very, very far apart, so it's not really a thing. So if you want to go this tenure track, then it's quite risky. You have to, and I mean, it's expected of you to move a lot. So you spend 1 year here and 1 year there. If some professor became ill, you do its lectures, and I mean, at the same time you get older and older, and of course you have no guarantee that you will get tenure. And I mean, by that time I was 30-ish already, and I thought if I now need another 5 years to get tenure, first of all, I'm married and I don't really want to drag my wife all over the world from university to university. And secondly, if it doesn't work out, then I'm 35 and then I have to look for a job with no experience in, working outside academia. So then I thought maybe it's better to get a proper job.
So go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just the area of mathematics that I did. I mean, even though I still think it's a cool idea, like you with your topological idea, as I said, it wasn't very popular in Germany at that time. So there weren't many positions available for model theory and things like that. So that also didn't help.
You were a little bit ahead of your time. So, what constitutes a proper job then? For a brilliant mathematician who's in his 30s and wants to do something else. For James Simons, it was becoming a hedge fund trader with Renaissance. So, what was the grand idea of Dr. Brunjes?
Well, somehow I mean, my father had always disillusioned me by telling me that the most difficult math he ever does at his job is like adding and subtracting or something. And I mean, if I could help it, I didn't want to add up like that. So I wanted to find something that actually has something to do with mathematics. And of course, I had always loved programming. So ideally also with computers. So then I was looking for something that actually does mathematics, and maybe not necessarily finance. I don't know. It somehow didn't appeal to me that much. So I did end up working for this company that did. I mean, actually, they had this big software suite for paper factories, but part of that suite was these saws that, when you make paper, you start with these huge cylinders, like several tons heavy, and then in the end you have like small business cards and toilet paper, and I mean, so you have to cut the big things into small things, and by cutting there's waste, or sometimes you can't avoid waste. So there's an optimization problem there. And part of the software suite was this paper cut optimization. So how do you set the knives on the machines and in which order do you cut, and which roll do you use for what machine of which width and so on, to have as little waste as possible and things like that. So that was actually mathematically quite interesting.
So you went full circle. You went back to the church basement with the printing press. Only this time you're optimizing paper. Did you get into origami at all? I have to ask if you're doing paper.
No, I don't. Although it does sound appealing. Maybe I should look at it.
Yeah. Okay. So you start working at this software company, and what was the transition from being in academia, because that was the dominant force of your life? You were always at a university working academic hours, to suddenly now working full-time for an actual company, and you have to get up in the morning and you have to actually show up on time and work 9 to 5. What was that transition like?
Actually, I mean, the first week or two was a bit bad, I suppose, but it was much easier than I had thought. I mean, my closest colleague also, was also a mathematician, and he also at Regensburg University. And he was a very gentle person, so that was very nice. I mean, of course, I also had this colleague, this old mathematician close to retirement, who, knew everything, and so he was a bit of a bother with the new upshots. But anyway, so actually it was fine, and I basically set my mark quite early. At some point, I got this task to do something simple, and then I solved it in a way that the colleagues hadn't expected. So instead, they thought, whatever. I basically didn't do what they said. I just abstracted it away and made it much simpler, and had a very simple model, and then I implemented everything in that model. So I had a solution very quickly. Didn't have to bother putting it in the real system, and could try it out and test it just in this abstraction, basically. And that really impressed my colleagues, because they wouldn't have done it like that. And from then on, it was like smooth sailing. So
you got hazed by the other mathematicians for a while until you found a creative solution. They say, okay, he's a cool guy. He knows what he's doing. We'll welcome him into the family. So Did you work continuously at the paper software company, or did you kind of jump around the industrial world, or what was your career like?
I mean, I should also mention that in Germany, we are still quite traditional. So I grew up that, by default, you never change jobs. You start working for a company, and then you make your career. You climb the career ladder there, and then you retire at that company. Obviously, sometimes people do, but by default, that's like the sort of ideal I grew up with. So I didn't have this urge to change jobs every 2 years or so. So as long as it was fine there, and I was happy there, I saw no need to change. And it was actually became quite interesting because by sheer luck, because one morning this older colleague, even though he was supposed to be there, he wasn't. So a phone call that was meant for him came to me. And I mean, it was actually we were a big company. So this paper thing was only a small department. So so that came from a different department. They asked for help, and they had actually not paper cutting, sondern a wood cutting client. And they wanted to know whether we can do something there. And because I now ended up answering for that, I was the one that then had this case, and I got involved, and then they needed a prototype so that was like a different type of saw, much more interesting mathematically as well. So I ended up writing the code.
You upgraded from flat paper to three-dimensional objects.
Yeah, the point is with this paper, it's basically a one-dimensional problem because it's just rolls and you just set the knives. So you can just set the knives in one direction. But this wood cutting thing, that was wooden boards. And so that saw you could, like, it was two-dimensional, like a puzzle. So that was actually really more interesting. So I ended up writing a prototype for them, which basically got us this contract. Was a several $1 million contract. So because they were very impressed that we could do this optimization part, and that was interesting for me because then for reasons, to save costs, we wanted to do the bulk of the development in India because we had like also departments in India. So that's how I ended up in India, which was like quite important for me personally.
Yeah, we're going to get to India, but I just have to point out this contrast. I love how you say Germany is behind, but they're literally hiring a theoretical mathematician to figure out how to cut wood. I mean, that's pretty rigorous there. Okay, all right. So you're working for this company. You've done the transition from theory to applied. You're actually working on really interesting problems, and then they say, Lars, you have to go to India, and they say, okay. So what happened there? I assume this is the first time you've ever been to India.
Yes, exactly.
And how old were you at the time? Were like 35, 36?
Right, that was like 10 years ago now. Yeah, more like 38 or something. I mean, I'm turning 50 this year, so probably I was like 40. So yeah, I'm probably one of the oldest guys at IOG, I'm afraid.
No, we got Wadler. We got a few others. You're okay. So you end up going to India. Did you take the wife along, or did you just go solo, or how did that work?
Later, I mean, I ended up going there often, and at some point, my wife also visited me for a couple of weeks. But that time, the first time, it was just me and two colleagues, I think, for 2 weeks, and it went very well. So I'm still grateful to that company, even though there are lots of frustration, lots of things I was unhappy about at that job. But that part, I'm still grateful that they sort of sent me to India, and that was really a very profound experience for me.
And this is going to be the fun part when we talk about all the different places you've lived now and the places you've been. But India is what was India like for you? Did you have a driver? Did they have a cook for you? What was did you just have to figure this all out yourself? I mean, what was that experience like?
They did pick. It started. We landed in Mumbai, but the company was in Pune, which is like 200 kilometers from Mumbai. So we landed in the middle of the night. The company had sent a car, and then in the night we were driving from Mumbai to Pune. So I got my very first impression after 12 hours flight or whatever, and that was already mind-boggling. I found. It's actually quite. Even though I think it's like 10 kilometers to leave Mumbai, and then another 10 kilometers once you reach Pune to get to the hotel, and the rest is motorway. But basically the bulk of the drive, even in the middle of the night, was just to get out of Mumbai and then later to enter Pune. So the traffic in the city is just crazy. But this motorway was also crazy because at some point there's this hill and it's 3 lanes each direction. And for whatever reason, then the truck drivers just decide to sleep for the night there on one of the 3 lanes. No matter which one. So it really felt like a video game. There are trucks on all 3 lanes, and everybody's weaving around them and past them, and it was crazy for me. I'd never for German used to following the rules.
I used to live in Jakarta, and I remember traffic is soul-destroyingly bad in Jakarta. It's soul-destroying. It's horrendous. So eventually, I bought a motorcycle because I was like, this is going to solve all of my problems, and I wrecked it 3 times in 4 months. But yeah, Ducati's a lifestyle. Yeah, and that's one of the things. The biggest transitions you'll notice, I think, going from Europe or North America to Asia. Is just how traffic is radically different, and how lights are optional, lanes are optional, and you just whatever goes, and whoever's got the biggest vehicle, the largest horn, tends to win. Okay, so how long were you in India for?
I mean, that time only 2 weeks or so, but in total, I think I'm not completely sure, but something like 8 months or so.
Okay.
I mean, I had 2 very long stints that were 2 months, 3 months, and then a couple of times 2 or 3 weeks each. But yes, I really love India. I mean, I love the food and I love the people. It's a fascinating place.
Right. Did you ever, while you're there, did you ever look into Vedic math or any of the historical math that India did?
No, I didn't. But I did do yoga classes with the proper...
I cannot see you doing yoga, Lars. I'm sorry. It's just not a reality I live in.
Yeah, I know. And I mean, it was very embarrassing because at the end of the course, I mean, the instructors couldn't even speak English, so they instructed in Hindi, and then some other colleague translated to me. And at the end, the instructors came over and basically told me how impressed they were. I mean, they said, it's so amazing that somebody with a body like yours tries this class.
Okay, so you're in India, you're learning these things, you're working on 3-dimensional wood cutting, and they tell you, hey, if you get your 20, you can do hyper trees. You go to 4-dimensional trees or something like that, but maybe that doesn't work so well. So why did you want to leave and come work for a crazy guy like me? What was the moment you decided that you needed a career change? Because as you mentioned, people tend to stay for long periods of time at their companies. So what was the frustration that kind of pushed you in that direction?
I mean, I actually know precisely what moment it was, because I mean, I had first come into contact with Haskell during my Cambridge time. Just another colleague, he made me aware of it. So I had done Haskell on and off since then, and also other programming languages. So I always loved experimenting with programming languages. But at some point, I settled on Haskell and decided Haskell is now, because I thought if you really want to be really good at something, you should concentrate on that one thing and try to really deepen it. So anyway, so I was very interested in Haskell, and I mean, but at that job, we did .NET C#, but .NET also has a functional language, is F#. Mm-hmm. So on some of the problems we had, I mean, they could be done or solved very nicely and much nicer in F# than C#. So I think 2 or 3 times I tried to convince my managers that we should do that and that would be a good idea, but of course got shut down any time. So that was already frustrating. But the biggest thing was, so I became more and more interested in Haskell, and then I got this invitation to a Haskell conference, the Haskell Exchange in London, to present there on something I'd done with neural networks. Mm-hmm. So I go to my manager and tell him about it, and he says, yeah, and so what? And I said, yeah, well, are you sending me? I mean, do I get that off? And are you paying for the flight? And because I assumed that it's a matter of, I mean, that they can be proud if an employee gets invited to a talk. But I mean, they said, but it has nothing to do with your work, and why would we pay for it? And no, and I mean, it was, and not even, I mean, it was just total blank. I mean, they had no idea why I would even consider that they should get involved in that. And that was the moment for me where I decided that it's time for me to go somewhere else.
That was the Milton stapler moment. They took the stapler, and you had to move on. Yeah. So obviously we were a Haskell shop, but there were many others like WellType and Twig and so forth. So what was appealing about the job offer we had for IOHK? Because I think you came on. The first time I met you was in Malta. I believe.
Yes, yes.
What was that, 2016 or 2017? I can't remember.
17, but I joined in November 16 part-time.
Okay.
Right.
And so what was appealing about IOHK?
I mean, first of all, of course, Haskell. But I mean, I must say, even though probably I shouldn't, it wasn't so much the blockchain thing. I mean, not that I don't think it was interesting, but I hadn't been a crypto like fanatic or enthusiast before, even though I had heard about Bitcoin and read a bit about it. But it was mostly, I mean, the science in general, because I thought it was so amazing that there's a company that actually takes the science and the research serious and uses Haskell. I thought that was so nice, especially with my background coming from this company where they do the same thing for 20 years and totally resistant to change. And then the company where actually, like academics and scientists are actually valued and where the company is basically built on them. I thought that was fascinating. And I thought it was really brave to do something as big as that in Haskell. So I also admired the...
Well, I was in a really difficult position when we were trying to figure out how to actually implement these protocols. So we knew that if we were choosing this academic peer-reviewed, philosophy, we would run into a situation where we output proper science papers. And so those papers are not easy to read. I mean, if you look at the Ouroboros paper or any of the things, the core papers of Cardano, we were left in a situation where normal engineers would struggle. Like if I went and hired a Python engineer or a JavaScript engineer. So I was thinking, okay, well, what type of engineer can I hire who can actually read Agalos's papers, can actually understand the science, interact with these guys? I said, all right, well, maybe the dependently typed crowd, the formal methods crowd, these guys, they're pretty serious, and that's a good bridge. The problem is most of those languages are just, to your point, ambitious. You're a little crazy if you go and try to build a production system that works on Windows with Idris or Acta or Isabelle. Right. And so I said, well, maybe Haskell makes sense. I'd read Real World Haskell, and it convinced me. And I wish I'd never read that book because it wasn't true that Haskell was the perfect language now for industrial work, and you could definitely go and write real applications and build real things. And it was really an OCaml versus Haskell thing. And I said, well, I don't like the French, so I don't want to deal with them all day long. I'm kidding. So let's do this Haskell thing, and it's going to be super easy. We're going to hire these great PhDs who are just like in love with Haskell, and everything's just going to work. We can use Quick Check. It's just all going to come together, and in 6 months we'll have this beautiful code base. And so the other deciding factor was we looked for an implementation of Bitcoin in Haskell, and there was one that was called Haskcoin. So I looked through it and I said, oh, okay, yeah, you can do proof of work in Haskell, and it's a very sensible system. So we should definitely be able to build cryptocurrency and get this thing to work. I think that was now like 5 years ago, and I've gained a lot of weight. The beard's gotten very white. We've certainly learned a lot along the way, and we've turned Haskell into, at least for us as a development company, a very good language to do the things that we do. But it's been brutal, absolutely brutal. So I believe when you came on in November of 2016, you were originally hired as a developer. But very quickly, we decided to put you into the education side of things. So can you talk a little bit about the initial code you were writing and then your kind of rough transition into director of education?
Right. I mean, I started working when I started, it was just thrown into, those days we didn't have like onboarding processes and stuff. So you just sent me some papers I was supposed to read, and I had to do this Bitcoin course or blockchain course on Coursera. And then I started coding on the node, the old Serocal node, and then after, that was only, as I said, it was only part-time at that point because I couldn't get out of my old job until March 2017, and that was Malta. So, and then I met Duncan and Philip there, and then I started doing like more interesting things. I don't actually recall precisely, but I was like in this formal methods direction modeling things. But then very soon the idea came up to do a Haskell course in Athens and you were looking for volunteers that are willing to teach that.
Right.
And I mean, that I haven't mentioned before, but the one thing that I missed most after leaving university was actually that I couldn't teach anymore. And that was also one of the reasons I loved India so much, because there the team was very young, and there I had these moments where I could like tell them stuff and teach them, and that was made me so happy. Somehow it was such a, I mean, warming feeling to be able to teach. So I realized how much I had missed that. So I jumped on the opportunity when it presented itself to do this Haskell course in Athens. And,
and that's probably the best place in the world to go and spend 2 or 3 months teaching Haskell to people. You know, Greece is just an incredible country, and the food is so good. So for the audience's benefit, one of the initiatives that we started very early on as a company is developer training. And the idea was that we'd go to a country, we'd work with a local university. In the case of Greece, I believe it was NTU and University of Athens, and Nikos was the one who helped us source those students. And basically, we'd get the best and brightest, usually 20-something recently got their degree in comp sci or math or something. And then we'd go and beat the hell out of them for 3 months and see if they could pass the course. And the course we did in Greece was the first. Then we did one in Barbados. Then we did one in Ethiopia, and then we did one in Mongolia. Mongolia was the only remote one because of Corona. But how large was the class in Greece? I think it was only like 10 students or something like that.
8 or so. It was quite small in Greece. Yes.
Yeah.
10,
and so, what was that like to go back to being Professor Brunjes after all this time off and teaching a Haskell class of all things in Greece? What did you like? What did you not like? What did you learn from that experience?
I mean, it was great because I really love teaching. I definitely don't like grading. So I was very glad that now in the recent courses, I had some other poor soul that had to do the grading for me. But in Athens, I did a lot of grading. And even though it's only 10 people, it takes a lot of time. And no, it was really great. Also, I mean, very rewarding afterwards. I mean, I was quite nervous because, I mean, Haskell, I'd never studied Haskell officially. And particularly, I'd never taught it, obviously. So I wasn't really sure how well I would be doing, but I got very nice feedback from the students, and most of them, or almost all of them, turned out to be very, very good. And I mean, of course, I didn't do the course alone. I mean, we'd have Andres Löw from Weltab, but still, I mean, it was at least partially my doing. So I was very pleased to see that not only do I enjoy it, I also seem to be quite good at it. And I mean, that was nice.
And for the audience's benefit, can you kind of take them through how these classes are structured and what we cover and so forth?
Right. I mean, one of the problems with Haskell is that it's very difficult to find advanced textbooks. I mean, there are lots of nice beginners books out there, but for advanced material, I mean, you end up reading scientific papers or blog posts and stuff. And so I believe our course is one of the very few where it's really goes very deep in like a structured, comprehensive manner. So the courses, as I said, I think it was 10 weeks. It's almost more or less 10 weeks. And it's like a full-time course. So lectures in the mornings. We experimented a bit at later course. We only had like lectures on three days a week, and then the other 2 days like exercises and stuff. But anyway, it's, I mean, basically a full-time course. So they have the lectures in the mornings, then they have exercises that they have to do at home. So it's very tough. It's very demanding for them. And that for 10 weeks. And we really start at the very beginning. So in principle, you wouldn't even need to know how to program, although it's probably helpful if you do. And I mean, start from the very beginning, but then go much deeper than any of the standard textbooks, beginners textbooks go. So also like practical stuff. And from the beginning, I think it was always called Haskell and cryptocurrencies. So the idea was always to do a Haskell course, but also, I mean, geared towards cryptocurrency. So we always pick our examples from the cryptocurrency world. So the projects they do is like writing a Bitcoin client or writing a peer-to-peer protocol and transaction validation and things like that. So it's very practical. And I mean, we also do theoretical stuff, monads, the infamous monads and other things, but also very practical network. I mean, mostly networking and parallelism and concurrency and those things. So I think it's a very nice mixture between down-to-earth, practically useful libraries and techniques, and the theory also, I mean, we go quite theoretical from lambda calculus, different flavors of lambda calculus, all the way to like networking and applying it to blockchain, and that for 10 weeks every day. So it's very tough, but afterwards, I mean, you really have a very solid foundation in Haskell, much more than just an introductory course.
So most of the people who take these courses, they start in the imperative world, and they write Java and Python and C, and they haven't done much functional programming. So what is that transition like for a lot of these developers as they're trying to wrap their head around functional programming? What have you noticed to have been the biggest stumbling blocks and aha moments?
I mean, as you say, I mean, that is very unusual in Haskell, that it's not imperative, and of course the side effects. So, I mean, once they grasp that, I mean, I don't know whether it's really, I mean, it's many different aha moments, of course, but I mean, to get this different way of thinking, which is also one of the things that the students always appreciate afterwards, that they got this completely new perspective, because by having to think functional, even if afterwards you don't work as a Haskell developer, it still gives you a totally new perspective on thinking about problems. And I think once they figure that out, that, I mean, it's very enriching for them.
Right. So concepts like recursion suddenly actually make sense in levels that people hadn't realized before.
Exactly.
Right. What about introducing the monad? That's kind of like the crown jewel of Haskell, right? So what have you noticed there? The pros and cons of those concepts. What have students struggled with?
I think that did go down surprisingly well. I mean, we try to, I mean, do that and motivate that with lots of examples. So, I mean, before we even use the M word, we just show that, I mean, in this situation with maybe, if you have state, or if you have the possibility of error, if you have IO, then it always leads to similar ugly patterns, and you always have similar solutions to make that nicer if you introduce some higher level abstractions. And then it falls quite natural that, I mean, to abstract that abstraction and give it a name, and the name is monad. So actually, I think that wasn't too bad for them to learn that. And I mean, there's this very, I mean, I think on Barbados, that was very popular, this lecture, where we basically start very simple with some pure expression where you can just have variables and can add them, and nothing else. And then we add feature after feature, like division, where suddenly you could divide by zero, so there could be errors, or where you have variables that have a predefined value, or maybe that later you can assign values. And each additional feature requires basically that you switch the monad. And if you do that right, you have to change very little code, because the monad is so abstract that most of the code can stay the same. And just by adding a new feature, you have to slightly tweak your monad, replace it by a different one, but it's all very logical and very nice. And that is, I think, a very popular lecture. It's also the most fun one to teach, actually, of the course we have. So, I mean, we try, of course, to motivate it with lots of examples to where these abstractions come from.
Right. And in later courses, especially as we moved to Mongolia, we started having a heavier Plutus emphasis. And so can you kind of compare and contrast Plutus to Haskell? What's different and what's the same?
I mean, Plutus is Haskell, sort of. I mean, it's just, I mean, Plutus script is its own language, but you take Haskell and it gets compiled to Plutus script. So in principle, it's just Haskell. So yeah, I mean, of course, independent from orthogonal to that is this extended UTXO model. So how do you have to think about the contracts, how it actually works? I mean, that is what I would call Plutus. I mean, that's a different story. And I mean, that you could do in principle. I mean, it wouldn't have to be Haskell. You could have done Plutus in Python or whatever. But I think that is, if you want to understand Plutus, that's the main thing. You have to understand this extended UTXO model, what it actually means, a smart contract in this context, what the validator is, and so this thinking in in transactions with inputs and outputs, and what properties the transaction has to have to be allowed to consume input. I mean, that you have to understand. That's the first step, or the most important step. And then, of course, you have to somehow express that in Haskell.
Right. So let's actually go into a practical example there. So, for example, the show we did last week, you guys showed off a DEX that you wrote in Plutus. So how does one go about building something like that? Let's say there's a developer listening and they say, hey, I want to write a Plutus application and these test nets are coming soon. How should they go about approaching, let's say, a DEX or a stablecoin or a project like that with the extended UTXO model in Plutus?
I mean, before you worry about Plutus itself, you must just translate the concept into the extended UTXO model. I mean, because things are different there. So I thought, I mean, how can I represent a liquidity pool? I mean, what should that be? And then, of course, you play in your mind with it. So I thought, okay, fine. I have this special script address that's now the liquidity pool, and there are these two liquidities of the different tokens in there. And now what? I mean, what should you be able to do with it? You should be able to swap. So you need a special, way to unlock the liquidity in there and swap. And then, okay, what should the conditions be? And that's then the same as in the white paper of Uniswap. I mean, there's just a mathematical formula what happens when you do these swaps. And then, I mean, what else do we want to do? If maybe somebody wants to add liquidity or remove liquidity. So and is that still possible? Could I do it like that? What else do I need? Is one script address really enough? Do I need two? What data do I have to, basically, what bookkeeping do I need? I mean, it's this. And I mean, it's normally not a linear process. I mean, you have some model in your mind, then you see whether you can do what you want to do, then you see you can't, so you go back and tweak something. But I mean, that's basically the same everywhere when you write software. So it's this back and forth in your mind, and then at some point you're confident enough that it should work, and then you can try to write it down in code. And of course, the order doesn't have to be like that. You can also start with some code and do some functionality and later rewrite it. And
so how long did it take you to design that Uniswap clone?
I would say a week, but I mean, mostly like in the evenings. It wasn't, I mean, my main problem was like, because I also had to learn Plutus, and Plutus is changing so rapidly that even though I wrote a book about it 2 years ago.
I wrote a book about it, but I have no idea how it works.
Yeah, they changed a lot in the meantime. And it's just very big. And I mean, there are lots of libraries, and I mean, just things you have to look up and get the names right and the signatures right. And that, I mean, this whole just setting up the infrastructure, and I mean, that was most of the time. But then, yeah, a couple of evenings took me. It wasn't too bad.
That's great. That's absolutely great. Okay, so let's talk about living in Ethiopia. So that's probably the most difficult of all the courses that you had to teach. So I call you up and I say, Lars, we're doing our next class in Ethiopia. Go talk to John, figure it out. So what happened next?
Luckily, not much, because it took a long time. I think you first told me about Ethiopia when you visited the course on Barbados.
Yeah.
And it was still exactly a year, basically, until Ethiopia happened. So at least I had time to adjust mentally to that, because I mean, arrangements took time and picking students took time. But actually, I mean, I really liked the Ethiopia course.
So let's go to the first day. You're flying. Did you fly Ethiopia Air, or how did you get into the country?
Lufthansa.
Okay. So did you fly direct from Germany to Ethiopia, or how did you get there?
Yeah, from Frankfurt. So I had to Munich, Frankfurt, Addis Ababa.
Okay.
That wasn't too bad. So because John was picking me up, John and his driver were picking me up at the airport. So I just had to somehow find the exit, which was a bit of a problem, because it seems there are two, and if somehow they warned me if I take the wrong one, then I'm lost forever. But I found the right one, and of course it was, I mean, problem with visa and so on. It was a bit difficult, because I think I had to get a visa there, so there was this very long queue, and I mean, it's always a bit unpleasant when you're tired and you arrive at a country where you have never been, and then you first you're worried that they will send you back, or some paperwork's not in order. But that was all fine. And then John met me there, and the driver, and took me to the hotel, and I had a beer or two, and so all was good.
So what hotel did you stay at?
Oh, that actually originally somehow John thought that I was like a very important person, so he wanted to park me in some 5-star hotel. But then he wanted to park my teaching assistant Polina in this French boutique hotel, and then I said, no, but that's horrible. I mean, we must be in the same hotel, otherwise, I mean, we want to like plan lectures and stuff, so it's super if we're in different hotels. And they said, yeah, but he can't afford to sit Polina into the 5-star hotel. And I said, that's fine, I go to that. And he said, oh, that's good, because it's so much more fun anyway. It's this lively crowd. And so it was this French guy who, for whatever reason, ended up in Addis Ababa having this small hotel with 20 rooms or so. And it seems every foreigner living in Ethiopia, or at least in Addis Ababa, at least once a week visited that hotel. So it seemed to be a very popular hot pub spot. And so it was fun. So you got some French cheeses and stuff on the menu as well. And they had this lovely backyard. I could sit outside. And so it was quite nice. I mean, not the most luxurious hotel I've ever been, but totally adequate. Very nice.
Okay, and it was John living there at the same time?
He had used to live in the hotel, but a couple of weeks before we arrived, I think he got his own house. So, but he was a frequent guest because all his friends used to meet there. So I saw John often at that hotel.
And what was the thing that surprised you the most about living in Ethiopia?
I mean, one thing I hadn't realized was the elevation, that it's 2,700 meters high, I think. So it's like, I mean, somehow I had expected if I go to Africa, I will be hot, but I was freezing my butt off, actually. I mean, not all the time, it was fine, but it was surprisingly cold. And of course, I was permanently out of breath because of the elevation. It's as if you're permanently running or something. So that was unexpected. And I don't know, I think I also didn't expect how religious the people are. So I think the very first thing one of my students ever asked me was whether I've heard of Jesus.
You're like, yes, I worked at his place. I was a gardener. And it was an all-women's class too. That was the first time we ever did that. The education minister requested it, and we had I think 17 or 18 from Ethiopia and 4 or 5 from Uganda, if I got the composition right.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, that was great. I think that was a wonderful idea to do that, and also very successful. And just to come back to India briefly, one of the things I really find amazing about India is that the women in IT, it's almost 50-50, and also in management. I mean, in some sense, India is still very traditional. I mean, very hierarchical, arranged marriages and so on. But in that regard, India is very progressive. And Germany, for example, is not. I mean, in India, there are far more women in IT than in Germany. So yeah, I really enjoyed doing this all-women class in Ethiopia. That was very nice.
And what was that like to teach an all-women's class, especially when there's such a strong gender imbalance in technology in Africa? Were they shy? I mean, how did they find their voice in that process?
Yeah, I think they were shy, but I'm not sure that had to do with them being women. I think it's more the education system in general, that it's more like authoritarian, that they're not supposed to ask so many questions. I don't know. It sounds silly, but I like, I mean, teaching women. I get along well with women. Somehow I think it's, I don't know. I don't think that was an issue that they were shy or so. I hope not. But I mean, at least later, I mean, they were definitely asked lots of questions, and I think they were fine with being taught by a man. And of course, we had Polina it was not just all male teachers, so that was also a good idea.
And we're definitely going to have Polina on People of IOG, and we'll get her side of the Ethiopia story. But from your side, what was it like working with Polina? She's also a mathematician who works with us.
Yes, that was cool. And that was also something that can only happen at IOG, that I think by the time Ethiopia happened, she had been working for us for almost a year, but John and I were the very first people she ever met in person working for IOG. So I mean, that's something that doesn't happen in many companies, that you can work there for a year and then only after a year meet somebody in person. So she told me that her mother was always very skeptical. Is that company for real? Are you sure that real people?
We assure you, we're real people. We're not just a bunch of dogs in a trench coat. Yeah. Okay. So 2 to 3 months training these Ethiopian gals, and actually, it was a very diverse class. And I think one of them had either a PhD or a master's in artificial intelligence, which really surprised me.
Right. Yes, and I'm not sure whether that was the same one, but one was also a college professor, I believe.
Yeah.
So,
and I think one of them worked for I can't remember her name, for Ben Gortzel with SingularityNet.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, because Ben mentioned that to me when I was in Wyoming with him, that that we, in fact, were now sharing an office with SingularityNet. They have one in Addison. We decided if we pooled resources, we can get a really beautiful office, and John likes beautiful offices, so he fought very hard to find a way to make that happen. I came for the graduation, as did Professor Wadler, and that was really an amazing event. I remember it was catered, and everybody got a certificate, and the Minister of Education spoke, and so forth. And we hired several of the graduates. I think maybe we hired 4 or 5. I can't remember.
I think at least 5.
Yeah. So that's Ethiopia Haskell edition. And actually, we're just about to do another African class. We're just in the early days of teaching a class in Ghana. And like Barbados to Ethiopia, that's probably going to be about 6 months to a year in the works. But hopefully we can do that in person. I can send you to Ghana. you can see Accra. It's a radically different place from Ethiopia.
Okay.
But quite fun. Okay, so you also, while you do the educational initiatives, do research. And one thing we haven't discussed is your collaboration with Professor Kasupis over at Oxford, and the game theory and economics work that you do. So let's talk about that. So, and the stake pool operators will be probably super interested in this, because you're one of the guys that's actually thinking about these very topics.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, I love teaching, but I mean, you can't only teach, I feel. I mean, at some point, I mean, first of all, you should also know what you're doing, and I mean, practice. I mean, in my case, I mean, if I teach Haskell, I should also write Haskell, of course. And besides, I mean, there are only that many Haskell classes. So, and I love mathematics, of course, and so I always wanted to do like not exclusively teaching. And so one of the things you asked me to do like 3 years ago, when now I don't know exactly, was to think about how to do incentives in proof of stake system or in Cardano. And so I started, and we had hired Elias, who's a game theorist at Oxford, and then he and I and Agelos and Katharina started thinking about how to set up an incentive system for Cardano that avoids the problems that Bitcoin, for example, has of pulling, I mean, leading to pools that are too large and too powerful. So we came up with a system that we are deploying now, and that so far does well, I think. I mean, it's maybe not ideal, and we are permanently discussing how to tweak it to make it better. But I mean, at least in principle, it works. We have 1,000 pools, and no pool is too big, and everybody gets staking rewards. So it's actually quite proud of that. That turned out so nicely, and it's cool to start thinking about something on a piece of paper and discussing it. I think you and I also discussed it one Urbana Champagne one evening.
Yeah, we were at Perkins eating pie, and we did have some discussions. That was when we were visiting Grigori at University of Illinois in Urbana.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's nice from such humble starts to actually see it deployed, and I mean, hundreds of people actually making a living of the outcome of that incentive system, and so that's cool.
Well, you know, when you start doing interdisciplinary academic work, there's always a difference in culture between each academic domain. So I imagine this was the first time you'd done game theory and mechanism design research.
Right.
So what was the difference working with a game theorist as opposed to collaborating with mathematicians?
I'm not so sure that I think it's more a matter of personality maybe in this case. And Elias is just a super nice and patient person. So very humble and very bright. So I didn't really notice, and I mean that was not a culture shock or anything. I mean, and I mean we just started very simple, so just asking simple questions. I mean, what do we actually want to achieve, and what's the easiest function we could do, and can we get away with that? And so I mean, we basically eased into the problem. And of course, I also mostly concentrated on the simulation part. So I could write fun Haskell programs, actually trying our mechanism and simulating it to see whether the Nash equilibria and so on that we come up with actually are achievable in practice. And so, yeah.
And around the same time you started doing the game theory research, I also remember I sent you to University of Oregon with Cowan and the rest, and you guys got a crash course in Coq and a crash course in formal methods. And so you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was really nice as well. I mean, first of all, Oregon, I'd never been on the West Coast. I think the furthest I'd ever gotten until that point was like Texas, furthest west. So Oregon was very nice, and it was this 2-week summer school. I think it's traditional, and it's every year 2 weeks type theory, something related. So the famous type theorist Bob Harper, for example, teaching there, and you sent me and I think Jake back in the days when he was still doing DevOps, and then Kevin, the guy, and to learn something about type theory there. And that was really nice. I mean, there are all these bright young people coming together. So I learned a lot. And I mean, I had never had a formal education. I mean, obviously I'd read a couple of papers over the years, but I didn't have a formal background in type theory. But afterwards, and especially being taught by the masters like Bob Harper, that I mean, it's very cool. And it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot about lambda calculus and gradual typing and dependent typing, and was lots of fun.
It was Edwin Brady there? I think there was
yes, exactly. I just want to say that was, I think, for me the most fun actually. So I also wrote some Idris software and did some homework, and it was really nice. So nice mixture of, I mean, it was like touristy in a sense for me. I mean, we also on the weekend in between, we did this excursion to the Pacific Ocean and these dunes, and very pretty. And then, of course, I mean, in the evenings was nice talking with the others, but also learned a lot. So it's a perfect environment for, I mean, very stimulating. I found very nice 2 weeks, and totally. It was the first American city or town I've ever been to where you can actually walk, or where other people actually walk. So I mean, it seems there in Eugene, it's a thing to walk. I mean, that was also new for me. It was a nice surprise.
It keeps you healthy.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. It's the same in Boulder. Everybody has to do outdoor activity. If you have to own a mountain bike and you have to hike and these things. And actually, I think this is you're one of the few people in the company that's met Cowan in person. So Cowan, there's a story behind that. So I wanted to do something with Lawrence Paulson. And Lawrence is a very famous computer scientist over at Cambridge, and he invented Isabelle. And I called up Lawrence and I said, Lawrence, we need to do some form of a collaboration. And he said, well, I'm really busy, but I tell you what, if you pay for a graduate student, I'll mentor him and put him on something interesting. And I said, okay, do you have any candidates? He said, well, there's this kid named Cowan, and I think he's from Thailand. And yeah, if you pay for his PhD, we'll do something cool together. I said, a Cambridge PhD? That's pretty expensive. He said, well, you got to pay to play. I'm Lawrence. I said, okay, Lawrence. So I caved after thinking about it for a month, and I ended up subsidizing Cowan's PhD. So he got to go to Cambridge. And they asked, well, what is he going to work on? I said, well, why don't you formalize Ouroboros? That forkable string theory we have there is really cool stuff. And that seems like a really nice, sexy Isabelle problem to go into. And this poor kid, he kind of got lost in the bureaucracy of IO Global and Cambridge. And so he just went off the mountaintop and wrote tens of thousands of lines of Isabelle code and systematically formalized all of Ouroboros. And none of the researchers were really paying much attention or aware that he was doing this. And every 6 months to a year, I'd call up Agalos and say, hey, you should probably talk to Colin if you're rewriting the Ouroboros paper, because he spent the last 2 years at Cambridge, like writing very rigorous proofs about this. And maybe it's a good idea to keep him in the loop about what you guys are doing. So I felt so bad about it that I said, well, we need to do something nice for him. And I asked him if he wanted to go to Oregon. Mm-hmm. And then that's why we sent him there. But I think he may have actually finished his PhD now. It's one of those guys, I only see him once every year to 2 years. And he's like the groundhog that comes. And if he sees his own shadow, we have another 6 months of Isabel work to do. Oh, man. All right, so let's talk about the future. So there's kind of two threads that you work on. There's more game theoretic research, because obviously the stake pool model is improving, and now we have Plutus Pioneers. So let's start with game theory. What's next on the stake pool side and the economic side and transaction fees and all kinds of things? Do you and Elias have any other projects in the queue?
I mean, there's always things one can think about. I mean, right now we're still busy tweaking the reward function, because there are, like certain observations we have from our stake pools that, like, for example, it's difficult for a small pool to attract delegation, or that some large pools find it better to split their pledge and create several pools, which should, we actually wanted to avoid things like that. So there, in that regard, there's lots to do still. And then, of course, there are all sorts of things, like, for example, now that ADA appreciated so much, the transaction fees also increase because they are paid in ADA. Mm-hmm. And we could, of course, change the protocol parameters and lower that, but that's a manual thing. So there are also certain ideas how one, could automate that, so that it's either via stablecoin or some other mechanism that automatically adjusts the fees. And now, of course, with Plutus, there are even more fees, because now the Plutus scripts also have operational fees. So that becomes even more important. So in that regard, there are lots of interesting questions that one can ask. And one can, of course, also make the models more interesting. We try to keep it simple in the beginning, but you can add more stuff like opportunity loss. If somebody runs a stake pool, he can't take the same money and put it on his bank account or buy a stock or something. So you can start taking things like that into account and make it more and more realistic. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think there's plenty to do for the next decades to improve the models.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. It's a big priority of ours to think about dynamic fee pricing, dynamic resource consumption, and resource modeling, and just determinism of resource modeling. I remember looking at RAML and these other models out of CMU just to see how much can you prove up front? What do you know on the back end? It's a really devil of a problem, especially if you want to use alternative field models. And this is one of the things we're exploring right now with sidechains. But let's go to the really sexy, exciting thing. Plutus Pioneers, I think this is probably going to be the largest class you've ever taught, probably the most intensive class you've ever taught. There's over 1,300 developers who've expressed interest. How the hell do you teach a class of that size and scale?
As you said, I've never done it, but yeah, we do our best, of course. So obviously, unfortunately, I can't help every single one of the students every time. So our idea is that, we will have a big forum and encourage the students to, ask questions and help each other. And of course, we will also monitor it and, see whether there are some questions that a lot of students have or some topics that are heatedly discussed, and then jump in. So yeah, we do our best. And it's a new thing. Such a big class, we have never done that. So we probably also play it by ear a bit and see, do the first couple of lectures, see what feedback we get, whether people are struggling with things. And then, we have, I have all the flexibility to adjust and then explain things again, or different things. Or if people want to see a certain topic, we can do that. So, it's always good if it's good and bad if you are part of something that has never happened before. It's bad because it's a bit rough around the edges, but it's good because you have a lot of influence on on what shape it takes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the pioneers will be fine, and I'm quite excited about it. Spent last night writing example Pluto's contracts that I can show, and I mean, for me, that's also a lot of fun, of course. I mean, preparing something like that. So I'm really looking forward to it.
It's the birth of a new programming language, a birth of a new ecosystem. It's exciting as hell. It's always humbling to see it, because we spent 4 years building this, and to see that actually wake up and come live is so incredibly humbling. So one last thing. One of the things that I've always been interested in is computational logic, and just this concept of how do we know things are actually correct and true, and how do we know a proof is right. So, hey, maybe we should express it in the way a computer can understand, and if it compiles, maybe it's right. So that's become actually pretty vogue in mathematics lately. It used to be you were a crazy person in the outside, but now thanks to the lean movement and a lot of progress there, we're starting to see modern graduate students wake up to this new reality. So another one of our newest collaborations, and I just signed the paperwork yesterday for it, so is with Jeremy Avogadro over at Carnegie Mellon University. So he's writing a textbook called Lean for Mathematicians, and we're subsidizing it so that he can get it done. Otherwise, it would take 5 years to get out. So we want to get it out as quickly as possible. And then the hope is that eventually we're going to create a center for formal mathematics at CMU, and that center will focus on the intersection of lean and automated theorem proving to mathematics and the formalization of mathematics in a machine understandable way. Now, why this is relevant to the blockchain space is that there's a cool little project called Quota that you and me, we've been talking about now for, I think, almost 5 years. We've never done anything with it. I promised Bill White I would do something with it, but you want to tell the audience a little bit about Quota and what that's trying to solve, why that's interesting.
Right. So I mean, the catchphrase would be mathematics on the blockchain, or all of mathematics on the blockchain. So the idea is that basically, I mean, there are mathematical theorems on the blockchain, and a transaction that puts a theorem on there must contain a proof, and it can maybe reference existing theorems that are already on the blockchain. So instead of, money that's transferred, you basically the blocks contain theorems and their proofs, or the transactions contain theorems and their proofs. And now, if you combine that, that is, of course, already cool, because then you have like the universal library of mathematics on the blockchain, like with all the usual advantages, decentralized and censorship resistant and so on. But if you combine it with an incentive model, then it can be really great, because then there's a way to basically earn money by proving stuff, which probably doesn't sound very exciting to most of people listening to this, but for mathematicians, it's actually very exciting that you can actually earn money by proving stuff. And it would be a great way to for inclusion, for example, for developing countries to if somebody from Ethiopia, for example, can earn some money or an income by proving mathematical theorems. And it's also a great way for nations or corporations to fund research in pure mathematics by setting like bounties, certain incentives for specific theorems. So it's a very exciting idea.
And it was one of those things that we never really knew how to get off the ground. And what's so fascinating is there's all these trends that are converging. Like, for example, the NFT marketplaces, they're saying, hey, let's create these non-fungible tokens. Well, a proof object is a non-fungible token. It's non-fungible asset. And then you can create all kinds of royalties. Like, if people cite your proof, you get part of the reward for that. So it creates a gold rush of people to prove foundational results. But actually, in general, it's a marketplace for deduction. And it's not just mathematical proof. There's also certification of programs. So let's say that you're a Plutus developer and you write the next Uniswap and you want to verify that it's correct by construction. You can actually put up bounties for people to prove that. And now you actually have a marketplace to do it. So this is a project that we're super excited to explore. And it's named after the QED manifesto. QED is Latin for quoderatum et seratum, which is that which has been shown. Usually when you write a math proof, you put QED at the bottom of it. And the manifesto was about a goal of making mathematics machine understandable so that we can involve computers in the proofwriting process. And what I've noticed when I do these interviews with our employees is that the beginning is the end and the end is the beginning. And that what I mean is that things you did as a child or as a teenager, they tend to come back in a different way, in a different form. So you were programming as a kid and always doing something with computers as a kid. And then you become a mathematician, then you become a programmer, and now you're kind of doing math stuff again, but also teaching. And all of a sudden programming is coming back, but it's coming back in a way where you can actually holistically utilize all of those skills. And that's just so cool that you can see that over a life arc.
That's true. Definitely.
Last question. You have this giant bookshelf behind you, and anybody who has the last time I saw that was Leslie Lamport when he came and spoke. He had also a giant bookshelf. So which one of your books on that bookshelf is your favorite?
I mean, it's not just math stuff. It's also novels and lots of Terry Pratchett. And I actually, I think Gödel, Escher, Bach could be here. I mean, I really like that, although I'm not completely sure.
Hofstadter. Did you read Strange Loop?
Yes, I did, actually, but long ago, like 20 years ago. So it is that old, right? Or even 30 years?
Well, Gödel, Escher, Bach is like 40 years old. It's I read that one when I was in my early 20s.
Right. There's another Hofstadter, Meta Magicum.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. Oh, one I wouldn't say it's my favorite one, but actually it has nothing to do with mathematics, but I think it's very cool. It's called Almost History. I bought it in the US in some bookshop. It's about history that could have happened but didn't, like if something in like the Morgenthau plan for after Second World War, so where they wanted to turn Germany into an agrarian society or things like that, and also from US history. That's actually very cool because, I mean, in my spare time, I read a lot of fantasy and science fiction and so on, and these alternative histories are always interesting. But that book, I've never seen anything like that. I mean, it's very cool. It's really written like a history book, but it's about history that didn't happen, but almost could have happened.
Right. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with people of IOG. It's a hell of a life story from a child of two countries, West and East Germany, and growing up in a very interesting culture and environment, globalizing a bit and having a chance to be a mathematician and a programmer, paper cutter, a professional paper guy, and not a tree cutter. Didn't get to the hyper trees. But we love having you here. You're one of our best people, and it's so much fun. All the work you've done and the diversity of the work you've done. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for being part of the IOG family. And are there any closing thoughts you have for our audience or for anyone else?
No, just thank you very much for having me. And it's really, I mean, I still can't believe that. I mean, from my relatively humble beginnings, that I'm now like sitting here talking with you and traveling to Ethiopia. And I mean, it's all these amazing opportunities, and I never expected that to happen. So that's actually very cool. But I mean, I have always believed, and I've always told people that one should just follow your passion or do what you're good at. So I somehow was always confident that if I do mathematics and try to do what I enjoy, that at some point I will find like the perfect job, and that luckily turned out to be true. So thank you very much.
Well, until next time, everyone, this is Charles Hoskinson and Lars Brunjes from warm, sunny Colorado and warm, sunny Regensburg, nearby the forest. Until next time, talk to you soon. Cheers.